Okay, so let's start this over again. And so welcome to the track on consumer identity. I'm clearly a consumer, and this is going to be quite emblematic of what I'm going to be talking about here. I'm the CTO at Uniken, and what I've been doing at Uniken is I've been building a security platform that combines identity, authentication, and channel security with endpoint threat detection to really focus on this notion of consumer-first security. And that's really what drew me to Uniken, this notion of consumer-first security, because I've been doing identity management for almost 2 decades. And yes, I did start very young, despite what the light might be telling you. But I've been doing, in the 2 decades that I've been doing this, what I've basically seen is not a lot of movement in the challenges that we're facing. We are still struggling to solve some of the same problems that have been struggling along. And why do I feel like we've not been progressing? Thank you. It's because of this look that we get from our users. Our users look when they have to deal with the technology that all of us have been building. It's this look that our admins have when they have to deal with our products, when they are deploying them, maintaining them, administering them. And that look is what drives me crazy, because it clearly shows that we are not addressing the fundamental problem that we're trying to solve here. So we're still, after all this time, talking about data breaches in the news. We're still talking about password management. Next slide. And we're still next slide. And we're still talking about that massive deprovisioning event that recently just happened. Next slide. Fundamentally, we are stuck in a rut, I believe. Like, we're running and we don't seem to be going anywhere. I don't think there's any other industry in technology that has been debating the exact same things for the last 10 to 15 years the way we have been discussing them. Next slide. So to prove that, I want to sort of do a quick interactive thing, which is a little hard with the lighting again, something I didn't expect. How many people here know what this is, right? I'm sure everybody's familiar with a YubiKey. OK. Keep your hands up. How many people use a YubiKey for personal use? Not because work mandates it, but for personal use. OK. Now, with all the people who have their hands up, how many people you have been able to convince family members or friends to use a YubiKey? Not many people? Great. You get an award after the talk. Talk to me. And this is not a slam on YubiKey in any way. Like, I actually like YubiKey a lot. But we, as an industry, are really bad at convincing consumers to use two-factor authentication. And Google introduced 2FA in Gmail 7 years ago. And they've done a really good job with it. They offer choice. They support many different kinds of second factors. And even after 7 years, only 10% of regular Gmail users have activated 2FA. And that would be an even smaller number if we took out every single person who works in identity and security, right? Let's do another experiment. Let's talk about password managers. How many people here use password managers? OK. How many people have been able to convince family and friends to use password managers? Keep your hands up. Of those friends and family members, how many of you have then convinced them to go through and change every single password so that it's unique and not reused across sites? Again, the numbers speak for itself. Yeah, next slide. We have some of the smartest people in identity in this room today. And our family members trust us. Right? They know that we know this stuff. They trust us on this stuff. And we, amongst ourselves, still are not able to convince them to do this, right? To do the right thing. Why is that? It's because we all fundamentally have indulged in the same thing. It's just that our approach to this has been shaming. We think of security as something where we have to, I've done this quite a bit, right? Where when I first read about that password manager logbook that you actually write down passwords on, I went online and I talked about who thought up this, who thought this was a good idea, et cetera. But I've then had discussions with a number of folks, right? And I've talked to my aunt about this, who I convinced to start using a password manager, and then she was still using something like this. Better than a sticky note, but at least it was in her desk locked up, but still. And the thing that I came to realize is that ultimately, at the end of the day, she's dealt with tech in a way that we don't necessarily engage with it in, right? She's dealt with blue screen of death. She's dealt with hard drives getting corrupted. She's dealt with laptops getting taken away and having to be replaced. She's not willing to trust the technology. So we need to understand that aspect of how our users approach our technology in order to solve some of these problems. And that's what I'm trying to point out, is that fundamentally in identity, we seem to forget what identity is about. It's about humans. It's about connecting. It's about getting stuff done and making things happen. And we all fundamentally, first and foremost, are technologists. So we fall into that fatal trap of a technologist to say that we think tech can solve all our problems. And we forget that human element. And as Ms. Blomstrom has said in her, I think it's her book called Emotional Banking, technology without the human component will simply deliver a bad experience that much faster. What we really need to do is focus on bringing back the human element. We need to remember what it means to be human. We need to remember human emotions like curiosity and prejudice, fluidity and choice, laziness. These are all factors in how humans engage with technology and how they interact every day that we need to bring to bear in how we develop our identity technologies. Next slide. So another quick show of hands. How many people have a UX researcher on their staff as they build identity products or have, and by the way, I'm talking about UX research, which is a science based on psychology and sociology, not UI designers, right? UX researchers who actually will go out and do UX research for you with actual end users. Great. Way more hands than I expected, which is really good to see. Microsoft doesn't count. Too much money. And Salesforce. And Salesforce doesn't count. Too much money. But my life changed when when I joined a startup where we actually had a UX researcher on staff. And this is a UX researcher who came trained in UX research and had no inkling of identity management beyond the fact that they actually were a consumer of identity technology. They understood that they had to log into stuff and stuff like that, but they were not trained in identity management. And that person fundamentally challenged some of the assumptions I was making that had been at the core of some of the stuff that I'd been building over all those many years. And that person showed me where my blind spots were, what I was not recognizing. They showed me the difference between user acceptance testing, which is what every single product vendor that I've ever been at does, where the QA team tests the product against the specs to see if it does what it was designed to do, which is very different from a UX researcher going out and testing with actual end users to see if the product does what the end user expects it to do. That fundamental gap is at the heart of a lot of our issues in technology. And that redesign of the thought process is really fundamental to how we need to think about UX. Quick anecdote on this, 2 anecdotes. One of the most recent ones is we've been rolling out our solution as part of a wealth management product. And wealth management is one of those industries where every single transaction is high risk, but the users are not going to take any kind of friction in the experience. They just don't have the time. And they actually break a lot of assumptions we make regarding UX, where high-risk user, yet their secretary has all their passwords and all their 2FA, right? That fundamental thought process where, oh, we can use their biometric registered through a facial recognition system, et cetera, and all of a sudden it's like it's not their facial recognition anymore in the system. But we're rolling this product out, and our customer had basically decided on facial recognition as the way that they wanted to do biometrics because they didn't want to rely on fingerprints and stuff. And what the UX research actually showed was that they were actually going to have a dramatic drop-off in usage. And the reason for that was, even though they thought facial recognition was actually convenient and acceptable, and this was in the Asian market where selfies and everything is quite common, they found that selfie-based recognition was really, really acceptable to the millennials and the younger clientele, but the older generation just wasn't comfortable with the idea of seeing their face on the camera. They just didn't like that visual that it presented to them. And so they actually made a switch. We actually through the UX research, discovered this actual emotional element to the authentication process that forces to actually put in a toggle, essentially, that switched between either self-recognition or contour-based recognition, where when the person put up the camera to their face, instead of seeing their own face reflected back, they saw contours of their face. And that was the way that we did the facial recognition. And that changed the discussion in the UX testing, because it really dramatically changed how accepting the end users were of the solution. Same concept, same technology, but a slightly different UX element that dramatically changed the engagement by the customer. Another story was about the rollout of federated authentication on mobile apps for a customer that had multiple mobile apps on their phone. And when we presented the way we were going to do federated authentication using OpenID Connect and all these technologies that we've all been working on for many, many years, the UX researchers just absolutely wouldn't have it. They were just dead set against it. Because they said, what do you mean that mobile app is going to open up a browser? It breaks the user experience. We're not taking the user out of the user experience. Users are going to get freaked out by this browser popping up. We accept that kind of flow because it's neat, it's clean, we understand the data flows, but the end users are not trained to accept this. We've trained them to accept passwords over many, many years, and we've told them browsers popping up, bad, phishing. And now we're saying, but accept this browser. In the UX research, everybody basically said, we're not going to push it up because we worry about App Store ratings. Our App Store ratings will go down, which means our product usage will go down. And when the solution, the answer to that was, well, we can get past that user hesitance because we can do training, right? We can send out communications by email, we can create training videos, and we can train users on how to use this. Next slide, please. That led to what I call the law of user manuals, which is that the more number of users that you have for your product, the less number of pages in your user manual that will actually ever get read by those users. And as you can see, it drops to zero pretty quickly. So this is how we need to think about our technologies not being stuck in the technologist frame of reference, but rather going back to UX. Next slide, please. And if you've been seeing my talks over the last few years, I've been talking about this concept called invisible identity, where we take an identity and we basically hide it from the view of the end user and basically put it underneath the covers as a silent enabler of our security platform. And next slide, please. I feel like Larry. I wonder why. In defining invisible identity, I defined these 4 principles for invisible identity that I defined, called understanding context, being adaptive, calm technology, and respect the user. So if those last 2 that I want to talk about, and really trying to understand those last 2, in researching that, what I came across was this book called The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, which when it was initially published was actually called The Psychology of Everyday Things. And he really goes into what is it that defines good user-facing technology. And there are 2 key characteristics that he defines for them: discoverability and feedback. Discoverability is the idea that the user can discover how to use your product, not through training, not through reading user manuals, but just discover how to use your product through the normal course of interacting with your product. And Don Norman gives an excellent example of this concept by just discussing how doors work and what kinds of doors are good and what kind of doors are bad, because how many times do we come up with a door and we just don't know whether we need to push it open or pull it open? And the concept of a simple thing like a door, but creating the concept of discoverability, where the user, just by walking up to the door, doesn't have to stop to think about how to interact with that door, but just open it. That's the concept of discoverability. The other aspect is feedback, which is letting the user know how they're doing and understand that. And it goes hand in hand with discoverability. And anybody who's used any identity management technologies knows how bad we are as an industry at feedback in terms of communicating to the user what they may or may not be doing wrong and leaving the user hanging, not knowing what to do. So every security talk has to have a hacker slide, and this is my hacker. Not all hackers wear hoodies and sit in dark places illuminated by the light of their laptop, though maybe it's identity folks sitting in dark rooms. Sometimes the hacker is the nice, well-dressed gentleman sitting next to you at the coffee shop, sipping the same cortado you may be drinking, while stealing all your passwords and stealing your tokens because they've hacked into the coffee shop Wi-Fi. Hackers break security by exploiting human nature. That's how they do it. They understand how humans behave. This is an example of a phishing attack that steals SMS-based OTPs, SMS-based 2FA. All the hacker did was knowing the end user that they were trying to connect, whose account they were trying to hack into, sent them a simple text message saying, hey, you have a number that I used to have. You're going to be receiving a code. Can you please send it back to me? And the user very nicely says, sure, and sends them back the OTP, right? Understanding that aspect of humans wanting to be helpful, trusting other humans, especially when you phrase the request very, very nicely and use nice words like please, something I wish my kids would learn. But use nice words and you can actually get people to do what you want. And hackers understand that. And what do we do when something like this happens? Well, next slide. This is the kind of response you see, which is we respond by calling the human, the person, the weakest link in the chain. Next slide. We blame the users, right? We all blame the user. Next slide, please. And sometimes we go overboard with blaming the users. And if you work in customer experience or the help desk, you have many, many different kinds of acronyms for describing your users, some of which I had no idea about until I started doing the research for this slide. But we fundamentally think of our end users as babies who have no idea what to do and how to do things, and we have to deal with them, and we have to show them the way, and it's oh so boring and so tiring, and I wish we would just not do that. Next slide, please. But what we really need to do is go back to this notion of understanding the human connection, right? Bringing the human element back into identity and understanding how we leverage that notion of human emotion as part of our products. Because if the hackers are exploiting human nature to break security, we cannot ignore that fact, and we need to be on the same page exploiting the human nature the exact same way in order to get people to do what we want them to do, the right way that they want, and enable them to do solutions the way that they want to do them. Next slide, please. So many, many years ago, Pam roped me into giving a talk at CIS on the Hitchhiker's Guide to Identity, and at that time, I talked about the original sin of the internet being that they did not build identity into the solution from the very beginning, and we've all been dealing with the chaos ever since. And since then, we've all been sort of solving this problem incrementally, identity-based security, software-defined perimeters, et cetera, some of the stuff. This is some of the stuff that I focus on quite extensively in our solution, bringing it down from layer 3 to, integrating identity from layer 3 all the way to layer 7. But what we really need to go to is layer 8. Which is the user layer. We need to have our solutions incorporate and understand how layer 8 operates and how to make it work for us. And we really need to focus on bringing that human element in a way that solves the problem. And so my call to action for most folks is, going back to that poll that I did, we need to make sure that UX research is part of any solution that we put together for identity. I would say that everybody who's building an identity product, everybody who is doing any kind of identity research, every single standards body that is out there, no standards should be developed today without having a UX researcher as part of the team, without prototyping the solution and having it go through actual UX testing. Because the standards solve the problem of how do two different technologies talk to each other. It doesn't solve the problem of how our end users actually use the solution. So I would argue that every single standards body that we have today needs to incorporate UX elements into its committee and make it part of the proposal for the standard before it ever goes out, because things work beautifully in the lab. The minute you push them out into the real world, they break really, really fast. And in the identity community, we've traditionally been really bad at solving that problem. So as we put together our products, as we put together our book of knowledge and the Identiverse Supreme, led by the Identiverse Supreme here, as we do stuff in ID Pro, I would argue UX research has to be part at the core of what we do within the identity community. And our book of knowledge has to incorporate this notion of making identity human again. So with that, that's my time, I think. Thank you very much. I don't even know if we have time for questions because this wasn't going, but I think we have a couple of minutes for questions if we have any. Though I can't see if anybody in their hand. Lance. Hey, sorry. Lance. So that's kind of, I would say that's one of the reasons why I'm saying that UX has to be core to the standards efforts, because we're standardizing user experience. The most successful standard user experience we have is the password, and that's why it refuses to die, because it is a standardized user experience that everybody can discover. It has good feedback, so we don't go away from it, and nothing that we've come up with since has been able to replicate that same amount of success. Arguably, the reason it succeeds is because it's got flaws in it, but still, that's what we should be aiming for. So that's why I said every standards effort should have UX, because then that would translate into how the products do it in the right way, and that can be bringing back, I mean, at the end of the day, UX is going to get owned by whatever business is offering it up to the consumer, right? They have to be in control of the UX because they understand the end user at a way that a product vendor like myself would never do. We will not understand your end user the way you do. So we have to have the right tools in place and the flexibility, but at the same time, the standards efforts is where a lot of this is going to get sorted out, in my opinion. Hey, Frank.
Just a quick comment. The point around UX and UX research absolutely is going on. But I think that the greater task is that everyone needs to improve their UX proficiency. So having UX researchers or designers in your team, absolutely, if you can afford it, if it makes sense for what you're building, etc., absolutely. Not all of us get that luxury, but I think all of us can improve our UX proficiency. I think that's part of hopefully what you're also driving towards.
Right.
Defining standards, and I don't know UX, it's hard to bring UX into the standard.
Right, I agree. And that's why when we talk, that's why I was saying, like when the Identiverse Supreme, who just left the room, when he's leading this initiative for the Book of Knowledge, part of that is to emphasize the fact that UX research has to be part of the work we're doing, whether it's in the standards, whether it's in the products. Because when it's a mindset that you adopt, and once you adopt that mindset, you can never look away. It's like it gets into your head and you just cannot unsee what you've seen, unlike some of the Ian Photoshops that we've seen before. So with that, that's my time, and I think I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Mary, ready?